Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are now to begin the last session of today's scientific diplomacies. Our first speaker is José Manuel Sánchez Ron from the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Theodor von Karman as a Cold War missionary in Spain.
What I am to present now is only a resume of some of the topics and details I deal with in my paper, the complete version of which you could have read. I won't discuss, for example, von Karman's interests related to industry, the Aerojet Engineer Corporation, for instance, although such interests must be considered too when we deal with transnational exchange during the Cold War and afterwards, as John Creeks pointed out this morning. Nor I will deal with what von Karman international exchanges and relations with the US Army and Air Forces, as well as NATO, meant to Caltech, von Karman institution. Also, even Paul Foreman has referred to that. I am sorry I have eliminated from my presentation what I wrote as regards von Karman's ideas about pure and applied mathematics. Will I have included all these topics, I will have to talk for more than 20 minutes. Among the many sides of Theodor von Karman's personality, one is particularly relevant to this meeting. He was a loyal and long-time collaborator with the military, first in Europe and afterwards in America. His relationship with the US military men were deep and prolonged. Nevertheless, he considered himself an internationalist, a man of the war, an image that was favored by his human kindness, great friendliness, and as wrote Hugh Dryden, director of NECA, and expresses interest in the activities of each individual in the company around him. What happened? Okay. Why did I say that such characteristics is relevant to this meeting? We are, do not forget, celebrating Paul Foreman, and one of his work is Scientific Internationalism and the Weimar Physicists, the ideology and its manipulation in Germany after World War I. Of course, I am not dealing here with the Weimar period, nor it is the object of the present conference. But it is possible to say something not quite different as what Paul himself wrote in the introduction of his paper. This essay, wrote Paul, is not limited to the Weimar physicists, nor does it extend to a consideration of the institutional form for international scientific relations established in the year following World War I. It aims to achieve some conceptual clarity about the ideology of scientific internalism. No, this is not yet. How do you can go backwards?
Arrow.
Which, yes, I am using the arrow, but that one? No.
One isn't going.
Well,
It's impossible.
don't look up on the...
It's too bad.
Its aim, I was saying, Paul wrote, is to achieve some conceptual clarity about the ideology of scientific internalism and to trace the fate of that ideology as it interacted in the Weimar period with political circumstances and with other elements of academic ideology. I argue that von Karman's activities as an internationalist add to our understanding of how scientific internalism was viewed, or perhaps better used, at least by some scientists during the Cold War period. And here I can refer again to Paul. One of the ways in which he came to be concerned with the Cold War is as a manifestation of compartmentalization. Did I say correctly, Paul? I tried many times to. Compartmentation, now yes, understood as the separation of different pieces or classes of information within the mind of one and the same knower. The prevention of the mental juxtaposition and cognitive integration of disparately labeled data. It is thus a psychic mechanism rather than a social mechanism, but a psychic mechanism with important consequences. End of the quote. And Theodor von Karman fits well in a compartmentalized scenario. This is so because of the manner in which he harmonized internationalism with militarism. In some sense, he viewed the engineers and scientists' collaboration with the military in a compartmentalized way. Perhaps, instead of speaking of compartmentation, we could use the word cynical or amoral. As a matter of fact, such words fit with von Karman's personality. Masborn, who knew well, here is a quotation from Karman, who I have not time to read, but which to me allows to speak as regards him of compartmentalization. As a matter of fact, such words, cynical or moral, fit with von Karman's personality. Masborn, who knew well von Karman, remember their papers they wrote about crystal lattices, wrote Masborn in his autobiography something that supports such view. He said that there, in his autobiography, that his friend had a strange mixture of kindliness in his relation to his friends and a bitter cynicism in regard to human affairs in general. In the draft of my paper that you have, I review von Karman's relationship with the military. This morning, Simone Turchetti mentioned some of them in connection with NATO. I also said in my paper what the U.S. Army Air Forces support meant to Caltech. Now I do not have time, as I said, to consider this, so I refer to what I wrote there. Now I will go directly to the main subject of my presentation, his relation with Spain. I said before that von Karman was an internationalist, a man of the war. He acted for 40 years on the international stage, introducing a committee of aeronautical experts to the deliberation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and convening regular international congress on fluid mechanics, applied mathematics, and rocketry. And one of his destinies was Spain. Let us see how he explained in his autobiography, von Karman, autobiography, his relation with Spain. Even though much of my recent effort has been directed to developing aeronautics research through the structure of NATO, I have tried to do what I can as an individual to go beyond this community of nations that President Truman once called the Ring of Steel, and expanded the principle of scientific cooperation to all nations, as I had done in my early years when my sister and I set up an international union of scientists in the field of fluid mechanics. Somehow, I felt that the job would be easier in the 1950s because aeronautics and astronautics were capturing the world's imagination and not as no other disciplines, except perhaps geographic exploration, have done before, and I thought almost everyone was becoming aware that the space belonged to all countries of the world, but it wasn't that way at all. On a visit to Spain's leading universities, for instance, I found little interest in aeronautical and astronautical science and consequently very little progress. Spain, I felt, was too important a nation to be left out of aerospace consideration in Europe, so I looked into the problem. Von Karman's relations with Spain started in 1947 when he became acquainted in London with the engineer, applied mathematician and physicist Esteban Terradas, who besides being professor at Madrid University was the president of an aeronautical institution created in 1942 that belonged to the Air Ministry, the Instituto Nacional de Técnica Aeronáutica, National Institute of Aeronautical Technique. This is a map of the headquarters of his campus. Terradas proposed von Karman that he came periodically to Spain to give lectures in aeronautics. His first visit was in October 1948, when he delivered in Madrid 4 lectures about aerodynamics of great velocities and turbulence. It was the first of many visits he made to Spain. Von Karman enjoyed Spain as he wrote in his autobiography, came to love the Spanish way of life, and he supplied throughout the following years, and again his word, the Spanish government and universities with a great deal of information on aeronautical developments and of the quotation, as well as helping them to have access to U.S. aeronautical institutions. This is, of course, is relevant to something that John Creech said this morning, the question of which knowledge can be shared and what cannot. To understand how valuable this was to the Spaniards, we must remember that then Spain was politically isolated. In December 1946, the General Assembly of the United Nations Organization passed a resolution barring the Franco government from memberships of the United Nations, specialized agencies, and recommending that all members of the organization immediately recall their ambassadors and ministers accredited there in Spain. Membership to NATO was equally forbidden. It will be not until November 1950 that the United Nations Organization admitted Spain. NATO was different. Spain only became a member of NATO on May 30, 1982. This was the international scenario in which Spain has to move when von Karman made his first visit to Spain in 1948. The institution which was responsible to the invitation, this National Aeronautical Institute, the National Military Aeronautic Research Institute, eagerly needed help for establishing relations with foreign aeronautical institutions, for had not experienced aviation a tremendous development during the recent World War, and development which has been continued, and was not Spain a marginalized nation among the victors of World War II? Von Karman was very important in that sense. Ever since 1948, he was a frequent, as I said, visitor to Spain, but he did not restrict to offer seminars and lectures, helping in many ways, of which I mention several in my paper, using for that materials of the von Karman collection deposited at the California Institute of Technology. As I said, an important problem was that the Spaniards were not admitted at aeronautical foreign centers, American centers. Von Karman used his connections to get those permissions. To put an example, on a date as early as July 27, 1948, that is before his first visit to Madrid, he wrote Hugh Dryden, the influence, as I mentioned too, director of the Aeronautical Research of NACA. Dear Hugh, this letter will introduce you Dr. Millán Barbani, a member of the Spanish Research Institute for Aeronautics, who is in this country for study and was highly recommended to me by Professor Terradas, the director of that institute. Dr. Millán is very much interested to visit the Bureau of Standard Aeronautical Laboratories and is especially interested in turbulent boundary layer. I would very much oblige you will help him in this matter as far as possible. Von Karman could not imagine then that Gregorio Millán will become a close collaborator of him. They first met in Paris during the academic year 1951-52 on the occasion of a course that von Karman developed at the Sorbonne. The Paris course and Millán's collaboration with von Karman had another consequence: the establishment of a Spanish group specialized in combustion, a group of international stature with benefit throughout the years of several contracts with US agencies. This is another way in which von Karman's influence became felt in Spain. Another example among the many I could use, this one with a clear political dimensions, appeared in a letter that Antonio Pérez Marín, at that time General Secretary of the INTA, the National Aeronautical Spanish Institute, he will be its director from 1962 until 1917, wrote to von Karman on December 21st, 1957. Here you have, dear Theodore, your help will be most valuable in the following matter. And this matter included missiles, contact for obtaining such manufacturing licenses, question related to Spanish as well as American industries. We should appreciate your advice, Pérez Marín wrote to von Karman, on whether we could send some of our engineers to take basic courses on the total missile system, as well as the partial system the assembly comprise, where this group could receive this training, and so on and so forth. The Spaniard efforts to try to penetrate the aerodynamics US war were constant, and von Karman offered good advice. I believe he wrote to Pérez Marín on February 1959, it was a good idea to invite General Davis to visit Spain. I will certainly try to persuade him to accept the invitation. And the Spaniards followed his advice, inviting General Davis, who was Major General of the USA Air Forces and Deputy Commander for Research, to Madrid. Davis and his wife, these details were important in order to favor the Spanish case, finally visited Spain, where they were, as always was von Karman. Here you have some example of how von Karman was welcome in Spain. Davis, I was saying, and his wife were royally treated. They stayed from May 14 till May 23rd, and besides visiting the army instead of his home, an official visit to the chief of the staff and the air defense chief, as well to the National Spanish Aeronautical Institution, they were taken to tourist visit, El Escorial, Toledo, Granada, Seville, and also to Abu Fight. With NATO far away from the Spanish possibilities, the Spaniards made many efforts to be admitted Another of von Karman's manifestation of his internationalism is regard to AGAR, the Advisory Group for Aeronautical Research and Department, which has been also Simon mentioned this morning, a NATO agency. Von Karman was his chairman from his conception, AGAR, in 1952 until his death a decade later. With NATO far away from the Spanish possibilities, the Spaniards made many efforts to be admitted in this lower military status organization, AGAR. Again, von Karman, chairman of the organization, tried to help. I have in my paper included many evidence on that regard. And however, in spite of all these efforts, Spain will not be admitted formally at AGAR, even as Spain's international position has improved, at least on one of the sides of the Cold War. On September 26, 1953, Spain and the United States signed their first diplomatic agreement. It dealt with mutual military assistance. The United States undertook to contribute to the effective air defense of Spain and to improve the equipment of its military and naval forces, while Spain will authorize the United States to develop, maintain, and utilize for military purposes, jointly with the government of Spain, such areas and facilities in territory under Spanish jurisdiction as may be agreed. It was, of course, a way to sort out the limitation that imposed to U.S. international politics the fact that Spain was not a member of NATO. And the U.S. American established several military bases in Spanish territory. It is true that to implement such a policy, which was most important to reduce Spain's international political marginalization, the United States did not need the relation of men like Theodore von Karman, but no doubt he helped both sides. He was a significant piece of that puzzle, a piece which helped the elaboration of the final scenario. Although I cannot enter in now in this question, let me mention that the consequences of the USA-Spain agreements were felt not only on politics, but also on science and technology, mainly in the field of nuclear energy and aerospace, though in the last case, the space tracking station, in this case, the Spain tracking stations, maintained jointly by NASA and INTA. And I am going to finish. I have quoted before from von Karman's autobiography the following statement. Even though much of my recent effort has been directed to developing astronautic research through the structure of NATO, I have tried to do what I can as an individual to go beyond this community of nations that President Truman once called the ring of steel. Reading such sentences, one can conclude that the Hungarian-born engineer was really a good-willed internationalist. And if so, what is the sense of calling him as I have done in the title of my presentation, a Cold War missionary in Spain? As I suggested before, von Karman's view of himself was not completely adjusted to reality. He navigated, apparently without problem, in an ambivalent, compartmentalized ideological world. Take, for instance, the following statement, also extracted from his autobiography. Despite his role in developing the technical specification for the NATO light fighter, Agar had not been concerned directly with weapons, but only with new scientific development that can be applied to weapons. Sometimes our research reaches far afield. For instance, when we set up a program for operational research or operational analysis, as it used to be called, a mathematical forecast based on the probabilities of determining and foreseeing how an operation will work out. These methods and so on. Here we find, again, an example on compartmentalization I referred to before. Compartmentalization, or using another of Paul Forman's characterization in his paper, Independence, Non-Transcendence for the History of Science, and I am quoting now Paul, an expression of the scientist's efforts to ignore the societal goal with which their activity has become so closely integrated since World War II. In von Karman's relation with Spain, it is difficult not to think that the fierce anti-communist of the Spanish regime would not have been agreeable to the also anti-communist Hungarian Theodore von Karman. Moreover, and besides the service of helping USA penetration in Spain, von Karman did not forget to transmit to the Spanish society a message the following message. The Soviet Union was dangerous, is dangerous. Read, for instance, what he was credited saying in an interview published in November 13, 1961, issued on one of the main, at that time, Madrid newspapers. Spanish newspapers, the Madrid, this was called. Manifestation of Theodor von Karman. Without atomic weapons, NATO will not be able to resist a Russian attack. Confronted with the possibility of a nuclear war, it is vital to achieve the vertical takeoff of aircraft. Declarations such as those certainly did not favor a peaceful climate of understanding between the two great protagonists of the Cold War. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Karin Sachman, Technische Universität München. She will speak about ambassadors of the new Ostpolitik, European Society for Nuclear Methods in Agriculture in the 1970s.
How do we get to the... here it is. Okay. Okay, so as you may see, I changed my title a bit, and now it's Ambassadors of the New Ostpolitik I keep, but I introduced some more actors. Not only I'm talking about the European Society on Nuclear Agriculture, but I thought I should also introduce some preceding actors and look how they shaped and challenged the Cold War order. But I will start and finish with the European Society. I call it ESNA, and here you find the logo. The society still exists, but now the N in the acronym became a new meaning. Now it's no longer nuclear, but it is new methods in agriculture. They changed in 1983. But I'm interested in the nuclear phase of this society. And it was founded in 1969 in Wageningen in the Netherlands. The founding fathers were a German physicist, Helmut Globrecht, and a Dutch biologist. And they introduced physicists, biologists, agricultural experts, and engineers to establish a cross-block European Society for Nuclear Methods, this ESNA. 1908 scientists from 16 European countries followed the invitation and convened at the foundation meeting in Wageningen. What was peculiar about this society? The society was a scientific society, but not on a specific, well-demarcated field, a scientific discipline, but research on the application of specific techniques, namely nuclear techniques. And this means the application of radioisotopes and nuclear radiation in the very broad field of agriculture and food. And throughout my paper, I will use this term, nuclear agriculture. The second peculiarity of the society was the envisioned geopolitical scope. The founding fathers aimed at getting away from the reality of the Iron Curtain and imagined cross-block collaboration and interaction. Of course, international collaboration in science and technology is as old as is science and technology itself, but the three wars of the 20th century dramatically transformed established ways of interaction in this area, and this is, of course, what our conference is about, and John gave us a very nice introduction this morning, also Jessica, about the changing flows of knowledge and also what Maria Jesus is doing about the circulation of knowledge. I'm building on all this work. The question is, when ESNA's founding fathers attempted to cut through the Iron Curtain to organize cross-block collaboration in science and its applications, did they question the international power system, or maybe they did not question the power system. From the mid-1960s, the United States reframed their attitudes toward Eastern Europe when President Johnson called for a policy of bridge building. And with the draft of a new European peace order, the West German Grand Coalition adapted to the US policy of rapprochement in that the Kiesinger-Brandt government began to think about accepting existing boundaries in Europe. The change, and thus the political climate changed in favor of rapprochement. And did this change encourage East-West collaboration in the field of science and technology? Did the politicians count on scientists and engineers as ambassadors of the new Ostpolitik? Or did the latter follow their own agendas when they worked toward existing networks and interaction beyond the Iron Curtain? And how did their colleagues in Eastern Europe respond to these approaches? It is the hypothesis of this paper that ESNA, acting as a non-governmental organization, aimed at opening up new channels of cross-block communication and interaction, and thus supplemented and supported Cold War diplomacies. I argue that, I argue, where I am here. Sorry, I need to read this. When I look for my sparse vocabulary, we will need much more time, so I stick to my paper. I argue that ESNA's commitment to foster cooperation across the whole of Europe is to be understood as an answer to the American challenge, as well as an attempt to capitalize on ideas of convergence. In order to understand the extent to which ESNA changed the rules and directions of knowledge flows and technology transfers, and thus participated in reshaping the Cold War order, we need to go back and see what kind of transnational networks and interactions existed before ESNA was set up. So in my paper, I will at first explore the concept of nuclear agriculture as an outcome of Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace initiative, and thus introduce it as a Cold War science. By focusing on both sides of divided Germany, I will outline very briefly, or I guess I skipped this part, how the development of nuclear agriculture in the 1950s and early 1960s was shaped via the emerging bipolarity of the Cold War order. In my second part, I will look at the United Nations and its special organizations, especially the Food and Agriculture Organization and the International Atomic Energy Agency, that emerged as international actors in the area of nuclear agriculture from the mid-1950s, also as an outcome of Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace initiative. Here I will investigate how the UN organizations influenced and framed the circulation of knowledge and thus contributed to the shaping of West-East relations. In the final part, I will depict the agenda of ESNA's founders and their activities to develop cross-block collaboration and interaction, and I will analyze shortly how GDR scientists and agents of science policy responded to the invitation of ESNA's founders to join the society and participate in cross-block European cooperation. So we will see how far we get. So here we have Eisenhower as he announced his administration's decision to promote international collaboration for peaceful use of the atom. And one field that he mentioned was agriculture. And well, then research in this field, however, had already commenced half a century earlier, shortly after radioactivity was discovered. But when the development of the atomic bomb generated a vast capacity for the production and of radiation sources, it also amplified the scope of activities in the new research field of nuclear biology and agriculture. Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace initiative boosted the emergence of national atomic research programs in the area of food and agriculture, as it did also in many other areas. At the same time, Atoms for Peace helped institutionalize transnational projects, programs, and initiatives to develop the field. Why was it so attractive, not only to researchers, but also to national governments? Work on nuclear agriculture required access to the technopolitical regimes of nuclearity, reactors and nuclear fuels to produce radioisotopes and radiation sources. John has also written about this. Tools, instruments, and installations, as well as the knowledge to deploy nuclear matter, safety regimes, regulations, etc. Therefore, participation in this field promised involvement in an important field of Cold War science and technology. Of course, knowledge on nuclear agriculture would not directly contribute to the construction of atomic bombs, but it was essential for avoiding nuclear illiteracy in the atomic age. Furthermore, exploring the effects of radioactivity on organic matter could help to deal with nuclear contamination, and more generally, mastering nuclear techniques in agriculture and food was charged with perceptions of assessing a horn of plenty. A means to dispose of food surpluses was extremely desirable, as it promised political strength, independence, and even political influence at the level of international relations in a situation where a rapidly increasing world population was nourishing fears of food shortages and famines. Now, in the two Germanys, the effort to develop nuclear research in agriculture and food commenced anew, and on a much larger scale in 1955. This was 10 years after the end of World War II had terminated all previously conducted research projects in several Kaiser Wilhelm institutes where geneticists, physicists, biochemists, biologists, and others collaborated and had begun to develop and explore new experimental systems and epistemic things employing radioactivity in the biological and life sciences. I skip here a little bit my paper. What I found intriguing then is when you look into the two Germanys, you find a parallel development in the 1950s with the governments pushing the field. Here you have Franz Josef Strauß as atomic minister and Karl Rambusch in East Germany. There they had an office for nuclear research and technology. And then you have comparable actors developing the field. I do not want to go into details more. Here, two researchers from the West, Kubrianov, from the East, Joseph Herman, who were busy in food irradiation. But there was one thing what was different, and this is how the bloc-intern transnationalism developed. And what I did find here is that West Germany was very well integrated into the OEEC and the West European community that developed, and various projects emerged at first under the direction of the United States, but then the Europeans got more room to maneuver, but what they did, they developed these transnational institutions. The acronyms are EPA is for European Productivity Agency, and the European Productivity Agency set up many projects. One is about the application of atomic science in agriculture and food. And here, this very much helped to develop the networking in Western Europe. Euratom, John has written about it, and many others set up a biology program that also developed food irradiation in Wageningen and financed several institutes, at least partly. And the European Nuclear Energy Agency also set up institutions like a study group on food irradiation. In Eastern Europe, it looked differently insofar as the Soviet Union at first favored bilateral relationships, and also they set up the Comecon quite early in 1949. It's really started to function, let's say, 10 years later, or at least only in the second half of the 1950s. And here, this permanent commission of the Comecon on the peaceful uses of the atom was set up only in 1960, and the East German scientists had been quite important to, and they forced this, what means forced? They asked the Soviet Union to set up such a structure in order to have a international collaboration in the field, because they considered this to be quite important. So what we see here is an emerging bipolar structure of knowledge and research networks that followed the political demarcations of the Cold War order. Of course, this bipolar structure was permeable as the researchers on both sides of the Iron Curtain watched carefully what happened on the other side, and they quoted each other in their publications. Mutual quotations, however, are not the same as immediate and direct collaboration. Okay, I have a few pictures. This is from this European Productivity Agency project, a canal with spent fuel elements, and they used Dutch canals for irradiation experiments. Here you have a reactor building of an institute in Wageningen. This was the only research reactor that was set up explicitly for use in agriculture. It was partly financed by Euratom. Okay, and now I go back to the international actors, and I do this because I think here an alternative to the bipolar structure emerged within the context of the United Nations and its special organizations, especially FAO and the International Atomic Energy Agency. This is one of the, Ronald Silo, Jacob Hamblin has written about him, and he is also a hero in my stories. He has been the head of the, originally a plant geneticist, and became a head of the FAO atomic branch that was set up in 1955 when the United Nations special organizations were asked to contribute to the Geneva Conference and to develop ideas how to integrate the upcoming International Atomic Energy Agency into the framework of the United Nations. And Silo then said, when the FAO was asked to participate in the Geneva Conference, the people there said, well, what do we have to do with atomic energy? And Silo was answering these questions in I quote him, "If our interpretation of the resolution is that the agency is to deal with something more than energy, we must be in a position to give the United Nations the impression that we are able to advise in our special field." So he wanted to determine the agenda of nuclear agriculture and not having the physicists doing this. And there was a lot of tension and conflict. I don't want to deal with this. I want to see what they have done. And the FAO has an approach, a regional approach. And within this regional approach, they started to act also with this atomic branch. The first thing what Silo did was in 1956, he established a European contact group on the application of radioisotopes and radiation in agricultural research. They also had lots of activities in Central America, but this is not my point of concern. I think Gisela may come back to this. But this European contact group was a West European contact group because the only country that was part of the FAO in the 1950s was Poland, and became a member in 1958. In 1958, then FAO had another meeting in Harwell, especially on food preservation. And here Poland participated, but well, to summarize this, in the 50s, the participation of East European countries was rather the exception than the rule via the activities than the FAO organized. This changed in the 60s because then more socialist countries became members, at first Romania, later on Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria. And what is interesting here, the FAO still followed this regional approach, and they set up a new study group for the Balkan countries on food irradiation. And this is interesting insofar this Balkan group is a group that is cross-block, because, and I better read this and also that I get it done quickly. The local organizer of the meeting was the Bulgarian Committee for the Peaceful Uses of Atomic Energy, but participants were Bulgaria, Greece, Romania, Turkey, and Yugoslavia. They convened in Sofia. The experts from Western Europe also participated at the invitation of the FRO with presentations on the technical and legal problems of food irradiation. Obviously, this food irradiation study group for the Balkan countries was designed as a pendant to the study group of the OECD country that I introduced earlier, and that existed as part of the West European network. The Balkan group, however, transgressed the political demarcations of the Cold War order. It was not only built on an envisioned revival of traditional, so always conflict-ridden links within the Balkan region, the inauguration of the Balkan group also implicitly imagined a north-south direction of knowledge flows, as Europeans from the northwest had been invited to give papers for a newly established group on the southeast of Europe. In the activities of the UN organizations, the north-south axis was given high priority, as we will see soon. Then I encountered another meeting in Sofia in 1973, but at this time, the Sofia meeting was organized by the Comecon, and now only socialist countries participated in this meeting. What is interesting here is that right in the moment when the new Ostpolitik began to emerge, the Comecon countries or the Soviet Union set up such a group within the Comecon and pulled the socialist countries closer together to work together on food irradiation and other topics in nuclear agriculture. This did not necessarily mean to preclude socialist states also from expanding their relations to the West and to the rest of the world. And therefore, the strengthening of intra-bloc collaboration within the Comecon did not contradict, but instead complement the strategies of rapprochement within the new Ostpolitik. Okay, this is a mobile food irradiator. Actually, it's a Canadian one, but this was the big hype in the 1960s, and this is what the participants of the Comecon meeting, they did not visit Canada, of course, but in Sofia, they had an excursion to the countryside, and Soviet engineers and Bulgarian engineers, they introduced this study group to these mobile irradiators. So, okay, and also what is interesting, a Hungarian food scientists had been present at the Comecon meeting, not as a Hungarian and from a brother state, but he became the head of the food preservation section of the joint FAO-IAEA division on nuclear agriculture. And as such, he lectured at this Comecon meeting, and so you see there are several connections. Okay, quite shortly, I want to introduce you to some more activities. Now, as they had been pushed by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and later on they formed a joint division in 1964 together with the FAO in order to develop this field further. This joint division still exists and is working on nuclear agriculture. And what is interesting, via the International Atomic Energy Agency, the socialist countries became earlier involved, because right at the moment when this agency was formed, all socialist countries, or nearly all, except for the GDR, became members. And and then they participated in conferences that the agency organized, in training courses, and most important, on research contract programs that the agency set up. And these research contract programs, they had individual ones and coordinated research contract programs, and the coordinated ones bound together several countries in common research projects. Some were funded, mostly from the developing countries, and from the developed countries they worked on a cost-free agreement basis. But via these programs, socialist countries participated in this framework of collaboration. But what is interesting, this collaboration was to help the developing countries, and it redirected the networking from a west-east, east-west axis towards a north-south axis. So this is what we have to keep in mind. And here we have, you see, this is from a publications from the agency in 1969, a publication that appeared within a series of the food freedom from hunger campaign that the FAO had set up. And it was on nuclear methods in agriculture. And you see the studies are mostly directed to the developing countries. Okay, here we have Hungarian researchers in Cyberstorf doing studies. Okay, well, I forgot one thing here. This is that so what I want to say is that with the United Nations framework helped to break open this bipolar pattern, but they redirected the collaboration into a north-south axis. But on the other hand, the United Nations, and Perrine referred to this morning, was bound to government membership in the United Nations, and so to some extent to diplomatic channels, and they could not completely ignore the politics of the Cold War. And this becomes obvious when we see the case of the GDR. GDR became member of the agency only in 1973, within the context of the new Ostpolitik, when the West had given up the Hallstein Doctrine that excluded East Germany from the United Nations. Okay, so, and very shortly, these are the founders of the European Society for Nuclear Methods in Agriculture, and I think they have more room for maneuver because they were founded as a non-governmental agency. These are the founders. Okay, they were established in a very specific point in time in the 1970s, a kind of crisis, breakup of the international monetary system, first oil price shock, global food crisis, very important, new environmentalism and anti-nuclear movement. And the ESNA established itself in this situation of crisis with the following goals. They wanted to solve two pressing global problems, the world food problem and the environmental problems. But what is interesting, they, to some extent, duplicated the structure of the joint division in the United FAO and Atomic Energy Agency. So the question is, why such a duplication of the joint division? One is that they had a specific geopolitical focus, and this was on the whole of Europe, whereas the joint division had a global perspective. And this perspective or this focus on Europe was to some extent a response to the American challenge that took a very specific form here in the case of food irradiation. But maybe I leave this to the discussion. And as I said already, they had a different political structure as they emerged as an NGO. So they could bypass the arena of political diplomacy, and they capitalized on the concept of convergence. They did so because they were set up in a crisis, anti-nuclear movements, and here they thought of their colleagues in the East that they are able. There was no anti-nuclear movement, not to some extent, and they thought of them that a nationalized economy is able to apply nuclear research, and therefore they are helpful in order to strengthen the field in Western Europe. Okay, so, and last point, what is interesting, how East Germany, that was approached by Grup several times to become a member of the European, of ESNA, how they reacted, and yeah, I have to tell you, they did not subscribe to the diplomatic mission of ESNA. They never became a member, as also the USSR did not, whereas all other East European countries became members and collaborated within this framework. Okay, I leave it at that and stop here. Yeah.
Our last speaker, Amanda. Our last speaker is Amanda McVeety. Is that correct? McVeety, from Miami University. The Rinderpest campaign and interspecies internationalism.
Okay, so I don't have any images, but I'm going to give you an image. So it's 1954, Ethiopia. You're in the countryside, but not too far in the countryside. And in the center of this image is a cow. So he's zebu. He looks a little bit emaciated to you, but his owner knows he's really healthy. You don't quite understand, the needs of the terrain. So on one side is his owner, and he's holding the cow, and he's talking to him, sort of petting him, trying to relax the cow. And on the other side is an American, a veterinarian, and he has a needle, yeah. Now, inside that needle is sort of the skeletal remains of rinderpest. Its ancestors were pure rinderpest, a morbillivirus. But Homo sapiens forced its ancestors through a number of passages in, say, a rabbit or a goat. It could be either. And all those passages through that other animal weakened the virus, attenuated it. So it's only a brief skeleton of what it used to be or what its ancestors were. And that's the vaccination. And so what I'm trying to do with my new project is think about what that moment means. Trying to make sense of this moment, of this vaccination of a cow in the history of international relations. Okay, so you can keep that in your head. At a 1946 veterinary meeting of FAO, participants, quote, came to the conclusion that rinderpest still represents a major menace to the world's food supply, and they felt that every effort should be made to eradicate the disease completely where it exists in enzootic form. It seemed a possible goal. The conference noted with the liveliest interest the cooperative research into this disease carried out by the United States and Canadian scientists, which resulted in the preparation of a vaccine of a new type, which is now being tested in the field in Africa and China. Rinderpest was not the only disease on their radar, but it was the most devastating of many. They estimated it killed about 2 million cows a year and buffalo. Conference participants recommended that FAO create a permanent subcommittee on animal health to address, quote, the essential need for action on the widest international lines in order to eradicate the major plagues and to reduce the losses due to other diseases. FAO began organizing its rinderpest eradication efforts the following year and convened a major conference on the dreaded Black Plague of cattle in Nairobi in 1948. Stress will be laid on the fact that rinderpest is no respecter of international boundaries, a FAO press release on the conference explained before it opened. And that complete control is possible only if governments work together in a coordinated program. The emphasis on international cooperation was critical, not only because it was true that rinderpest paid no attention to political boundaries, but also because FAO's entire existence depended on showing that human prosperity could best be achieved through global, not local, efforts. In 1955, FAO published a 10-year anniversary retrospective on its activities in the field by P. Lamartine Yates. He opened it insisting, man is a striving animal, hungry for material advancement and moral improvement. And FAO had to be created as a vehicle for this striving, the book continued, because the radically changed condition of the world makes old vehicles as obsolete as the stagecoach. New times, new institutions. The international agencies connected to the United Nations were therefore not simply useful, but necessary. then have found that they need these additional administrative instruments in their attempt to regulate and control their environment. Recognition began at the national level, but was now focused on the international. Quote, in respective relationships between people of different nations, the feeling of belonging to one single family is still quite weak, Yeats admitted. But FAO and its fellow agencies in the United Nations systems were trying desperately to change that, in large part by proving Yeats's claim that humans need these additional administrative instruments to control and regulate their environment. Leadership at FAO and at the other UN specialized agencies celebrated the concept of expanding power over the non-human in order to better unite humans. The book project this paper comes from will use the first decade of the FAO-directed effort to eradicate rinderpest to demonstrate how post-World War II internationalism based a critical part of its identity and its credibility on expanding human control over the non-human, particularly over non-human living things. A battle against a virus that killed cattle, which used rabbits, sheep, goats, and chicken eggs in the production of vaccines, the rinderpest campaign is a particularly rich example of what I have labeled interspecies internationalism. The term highlights how human interactions with the non-human were at the heart of the post-war effort to unite Homo sapiens and to develop the environments in which they lived. So part of what I want to do with this is dealing with what Perrin pointed out this morning about thinking about the United Nations and some of its activities outside of the Cold War story. That what you see with rinderpest is a scientific diplomacy, as this panel is labeled, that began long before the Cold War and that lasted long after it. Rinderpest eradication was declared by FAO in 2011, so it's a story that spans beyond the Cold War. The human struggle against rinderpest really takes shape in a systematic way in the 1700s and in 1863, and that's at a national level. And in 1863, there's a veterinary conference in Hamburg of European veterinarians to talk about rinderpest control through quarantine. And so quarantine efforts continue on an international level, past that in Europe, and they are successful in Europe in getting rid of rinderpest via quarantine. At the same time, there's these scientific explorations in vaccination technologies, which begins with Koch finding a serum in South Africa in 1897. So it starts with sort of just injecting a serum, and then goes all the way in the 1920s into goat attenuated vaccines and rabbit attenuated vaccines. But the effort on an international level really sort of takes off in World War II because of the United States and Canada. In 1941, the governments of Canada and the United States decided that concern that Germany or Japan might try to introduce rinderpest to North America warranted defensive maneuvers. Early the following year, they established a secret research lab on Grosse Isle and the lower St. Lawrence River. They sent scientists from both nations, Canadian Army service personnel, and a large number of calves from both local farmers and the Montreal stockyards. Government officials charged the scientists with two tasks. One, to prepare a tissue vaccine according to methods previously developed in order to provide rapidly the means of surrounding an epizootic should it occur with a ring of immunized animals. And two, investigate the possibility of developing an efficient vaccine, which could be produced more economically and without requiring the use of a large number of animals. So they need something that doesn't require rabbits or goats or sheep. The scientists proved successful at both, notably creating a vaccine from rinderpest cultivated in embryonating hen's eggs, specifically fertile barred Plymouth Rock eggs. This avionized vaccine was deemed superior to previous vaccines because it was cheaper to produce and because it provoked a milder reaction in vaccinated cattle than the goat attenuated version. Advances in vaccine technology provided new possibilities in the human struggle against rinderpest. Europe had been able to exile the virus through strict quarantine measures, but that was not possible in regions such as large swaths of Africa and Asia, where wild and domesticated ungulates crossed paths on a regular basis. Vaccination, however, could drive the virus out of livestock populations by immunizing herds to a point where the virus could not gain a foothold. quarantine was a defensive measure to keep the virus from crossing the borders, vaccination was an offensive maneuver to alter the virus's ability to establish a presence in a region. It started at the center and moved outward. Where it stopped was a matter of resources and coordination. As scientists from the later years of the Rinderpest campaign noted when reflecting on their predecessors of the 1940s. If undertaken on a wide enough scale, the individual farmer's herd became a national herd, at which point it became clear that if vaccine could eliminate rinderpest from a national herd, it could do the same at an international level. It was then only a question of time before eradication became the compelling issue related to rinderpest. Vaccination was necessarily a grassroots activity that had to proceed one cow at a time. Eradication was necessarily a global state that demanded international coordination. And this is where the UN stepped in. In 1946, veterinarians working at the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration began administering the gross isle vaccine in China, which was then in the midst of a terrible outbreak. FAO took over those activities in 1947. They began coordinating action in a number of countries, including China, Burma, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, Nepal, Bhutan, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Nigeria. And those were the initial countries. On the ground, they brought in vaccines, helped build vaccine production laboratories, and taught locals how to make and administer vaccines. At the top, they organized conferences that brought representatives of various countries together to facilitate cooperation. FAO partnered with nations, and FAO helped nations partner with each other for a goal that could not effectively be achieved in isolation, from individual herds to national herds to regional herds to eradication. So that's what FAO's doing. But then this question is, what do we make of it? How do we explain what's really going on with this international activity? In his 1946 pamphlet, UNESCO, Its Purposes and Its Philosophy, Julian Huxley, the first director of UNESCO, insisted that the agency could, quote, help the peoples of the world to mutual understanding and to a realization of the common humanity and common tasks which they share, as opposed to the nationalisms which too often tend to isolate and separate them. It can also, quote, promote the growth of international organizations themselves, he continued. In particular, it can be both on its own account and in close relations with other UN agencies, such as FAO and the World Health Organization, promote the international application of science to human welfare. It can help fund large-scale campaigns that put advances in the fields of bacteriology and microbiology to work on the ground around the world. UNESCO, Huxley concluded, must strain every nerve to give a demonstration of the benefits, spiritual as well as material, to be obtained by international cooperation in education, science, and culture. People needed to see the kinds of progress in the advancement of human welfare that were only possible through organization at the international level. The world is potentially one, Huxley insisted, and human needs are the same in every part of it, to understand, to control it, and to enjoy it. International cooperation made that kind of power possible. Lord John Boyd Orr, the first Director General of FAO, agreed, arguing in his 1949 Nobel lecture that the road to peace lies only through the cooperation of governments in developing the vast potential wealth of the earth for the benefit of all. With the United Nations and its specialized agencies, Orr continued, here at last mankind has the machinery through which governments can join in eliminating hunger, poverty, and disease. Old enemies could finally be defeated through new organization. Huxley and Orr celebrated both advances in knowledge and advances in administration, insisting that global perspective and global organization would maximize potential advances in human welfare. This was in part because international agencies ostensibly had access to more funding than national governments, although that was certainly not the case for the world's wealthiest countries. But it was also because the targets of their interest were not bound by national boundaries. Their focus on building a common humanity highlighted the common inhumanity of the living things that stood in the way of the human need, as Huxley had insisted, to control and to enjoy the world. Humans could do a better job of it if they were more organized in their efforts. That was the purpose of these new international agencies, to bolster the goal of the UN's admittedly most radical leaders, establishing a belief in a common humanity through demonstrated success in the regulation and control of the environment, through dominion over the non-human. Oh, sorry.
To comment and to have to comment on all of them. Each in its own way shows the powerful links between science and international politics in the Cold War years. Probably never before the aftermath of World War II came science and international order so close together. Interestingly, in all the three papers, it is extremely hard to tell whether science diplomacy was a means to political diplomacy or the other way around. In Cience's paper, we learn of Theodor von Karman's many-sided activities in Franco-East Spain as a lecturer, as an advisor to Spain's aeronautical military efforts, as a mediator between Spanish and US political and military authorities, as a lobbyist in Spain for US businessmen, as a mentor for Spanish scientists in the US and elsewhere. Scientific and technological knowledge appear here as an international commodity. The Franco regime was hungry for it and also desperately in need of international contacts and collaboration, of international existence. Von Karman, acting as a high-standing representative for US agencies, played a crucial role in ensuring ties with Spain, which was a non-NATO member, but at the same time, a crucial military ally for geostrategical reasons. The paper poses the problem of von Karman's moral choices. Of course, we all know Spain was the 40s and 50s. Spain was a totalitarian state. And that had all kinds of implications, both for the population at large and in particular for scientific and technological institutions. Let me see that if I may see a moral dark side, which is clearly there in von Karman's personality, is indeed in his easygoing collaboration with a murderous and totalitarian regime. To what extent was von Karman aware of what was going on in Spain in Spanish society and in Spanish scientific institutions? I would like to know more about that. Citation construes both von Karman's character and von Karman's scientific or political role in Franco-East Spain as defined at bottom by a tension between his internationalism, quotation marks, and his militant anti-communism and straightforward engagement with the military uses of science. Of course, internationalism played a key discursive role in setting up post-World War II international organizations, and accordingly, internationalism appears prominently in the three papers that we have here and that we're here discussing. Internationalism was a key word. It is, however, at least to me, an equivocal, polysemic word. The precise political meaning of which seems hard to pin down. I think von Karman's internationalism is, in this paper, appears characterized rather in psychological than in political terms. And I would like to see how von Karman's internationalism can be construed in ways that are more social than personal. The notion of internationalism looms large in McVitie's insightful paper on FAO's Rinderpest campaign. I think the paper beautifully shows how rinderpest was recognized as a global threat since at least the late 19th century. The late 19th century devastating African pandemic provoked by the importation to Ethiopia of cattle from India. And yet, a global fight against rinderpest, a global campaign was not started until the end of the World War II, pointing to the crucial role that the new social intellectual context provided for this kind of effort to eradicate rinderpest. Internationalism, McVitie characterizes as both a political reaction against the right-wing totalitarianisms that set off World War II, and the political conviction that in order to fight against disease and famine and to put science at the service of human welfare, to do that, global, worldwide, international efforts are vastly more efficient than local and locally coordinated efforts. And McVitie convincingly shows as well that and this I find it fascinating, that defeating rinderpest became in itself a major symbol, major paradigm of the power and necessity of international cooperation. So the international ideal was vindicated and boosted by the successes of the rinderpest campaign. And a final point that I would like to stress here in relation to this paper is that I find intriguing the McVitie's passing observation that FAO focused on building the notion of a, quotation mark, common humanity by successfully regulating what was perceived as utterly non-human. That is, by regulating living things that threaten human life. Or to put it in other words, expanding the power over the non-human would appear to be an efficient way to better unite humans. This is an intriguing thought. I would like to see that more fully explained. Finally, we come to Zachman's paper on ESNA. One of the things that I enjoyed in this paper is the way it brings to life the nature and importance of nuclear agriculture. If I imagine a supermarket stand with a label nuclear agriculture, I can imagine the success of it right now. And yet, nuclear agriculture was, as the paper beautifully shows, was important, was novel, was politically relevant, and was socially relevant as well. I won't say more about that, but it has called my attention at this parallel between nuclear medicine, which has come to stay, and nuclear agriculture, which is gone with the wind. But then the focus of the paper, of course, is not that. The focus of the paper is in nuclear agriculture and how this novel field made up of new questions and new techniques, how this made possible for scientists to put it at the center of efforts to cross the block polarity in the Cold War. And I think the paper very, very commonly shows that there is a difference between efforts done by some international agencies like Euratom or the FAO Commission and other agencies, mostly inspired by the United Nations, which were much more successful in crossing these barriers. there is another aspect here that I like in putting together these two papers, McVitie's and Sachman's. The one, McVitie's is, in a way, it's a story of FAO's success, while in Sachman's we have a story in which FAO's limits were clear. And it was only when FAO created the joint division with the International Atomic Energy Agency, it was only then that FAO became really an agent of crossing borders, but not before. I mean, when the FAO in itself was clearly. This seemed to me very, very important features of scientific collaboration. But they bring me to my last point, or my last comment on the whole of the papers. It seems to me that since we have some instances in which some agencies worked well to reinforce block polarities, and others worked well in helping to cross these polarities. And given the different ways in which internationalism has been managed here, I think it's prudent to say, it's wise to say that internationalism in itself explains little. Internationalism, of course, was a key word in post-World War II. It was a big word. It seems to embody a nice altruistic agenda, but yet it may hide very real, very actual, very deep political problems. For one thing, internationalism was never predicated against nation states, at least not against those nations that won the war. Internationalism, in a way, was the most efficient way to ensure that nations could continue to exist. In fact, there was a lot of supranational talk in post-World War II Europe. Supranationality was very much in the agenda in the late 40s and early 50s in Europe. And of course, it was very much despised by France and by England. In fact, let me stress that Western integration is somehow taken for granted in all the papers. But Western integration was not an obvious result of the war, of the end of the world. Western integration was a huge political problem, both in itself and for the consequences it had for scientific institutions. Let me recall that weird story about the groupement des mathématiciens d'expression latine, something that nobody remembers today about that thing. But that for at least 15 years, that was an international organization set up essentially by the French government with the powerful help of Italy and Belgium. And they tried to, it was still playing the game of isolating Germany. And it was still playing the game of preserving the status of French culture and French language, and that not as part of a politically integrated Europe, but not at all. So, and that went on until the early 60s, in which really the new common market settled in, and the agenda was redirected towards what we now take for granted, and what we now see in danger of crumbling away again. So, to end this very long day, I think the papers, the three papers teach us a lot about international cooperation as a major force, shaping post-World War II science and technology. But they always teach us a lot about the limits and limitations of internationalism, both as a program in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and as a notion that we should handle with a more careful way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. All the papers have been very interesting, and also the comments. A couple of things on international organizations. First is what you think if we say that internationalism was sort of part of the US atomic agenda, more than something that was there just to be part of, at least from the Marshall Plan on. Then there's a comment for McVitie on this history of vaccines. That is also a history of standards, standardization in a way, no? So it's a history of how vaccination became standardized, and this standardization was part of, this international trend, of course, before World War II, because it's at the origin of health policies as we know them today. And there's my last comment for Karen on, the relation of FAO with other international organizations of the time. I mean, this invention of development and the OECD and WHO that was also related to your vaccine issue. So there were a set of international organizations being created at the time with the same sort of shared ideology, and also most of them, as far as I can see them, part of this political agenda that was constructed on diplomacy, and of course, as Malet has said, on scientific and technological knowledge, let's say, and practices. Thank you.
Okay, one quick observation. Janvi Falke from King's College London. I absolutely found your comments on tenir wonderful, and there's one thing that I think, that was a question that I was going to pose to the panel, but I think your comments brought it out wonderfully, which is that international collaboration is not internationalism, and that analytically we need to separate and understand these two empirically a bit more carefully as historians. And I have just one small comment, which is I just simply have to say this as someone who has studied science and empire and who works from archives in India especially, but have looked at other things. To Amanda, I found your picturization of the sorry ass third world cow really disturbing. Because sort of posing the Western rationalist veterinarian and the cow-loving Ethiopian farmer with this lean cow, I think it's a deeply, deeply disturbing Orientalist image. One needs to work through it a bit more carefully, because if you have European rinderpest being done away with quarantine and vaccination being introduced in a context where it's not explained, etc. I mean, there's huge historiographical literature on this, looking at the introduction of Pasteur laboratories in colonies and its connections also to development literature in the middle of the 20th century, which predates even the Cold War. You'd be able to draw on that probably far more fruitfully, and I'm sure you're even aware of that literature already. But I think that image is deeply disturbing, and because it doesn't add to the historiography, it actually leaves little space actually to negotiate politics.
Jessica Wan, UBC. I also want to echo the strengths of Anthony's comments, just because there are so many different variants of internationalism, if you don't want to distinguish between that and international collaboration. But one has to be very careful in being clear about what one means by internationalism. And so in the case of von Karaman, his internationalism is not of the variant that seeks to find an alternative to the bipolar order. Rather, I'm not sure the setting up of the paper as a kind of conundrum of explaining this internationalism versus his military connections really works, just because it's very clear to me that his internationalism is perfectly consistent with his sort of Cold War beliefs. And it's also perfectly consistent with a regime of American foreign policy that was arguably not simply anti-communist during the Cold War, but frequently quite openly pro-right-wing at the same time. And so I think his internationalism is very consistent with the rest of his sort of political identity. But in the other two papers, though, there's also the question of, well, what are the ways in which the bipolar conflict also shapes and conditions the internationalism at work? I think Karin's Lahm paper certainly speaks to, you know, the very convoluted dynamic and the way in which Ostpolitik plays into the internationalization of food irradiation. In Amanda's paper, I was kind of wondering where sort of Erez Manella's account of smallpox eradication might fit here, in the sense that he argues that that's a case in which the Soviet and American participation in this international project is on both sides very much for their own Cold War goals. And so there is that kind of, I don't know if Rinderpest is the same, but arguably there's also very much a kind of Cold War element that's being played out here as well.
Yes, I'm Lino from the Teus project. So my question, I've been noticing a common thread to this panel on scientific diplomacy, which is economic diplomacy. And you know how the people like Gerard Nash or David Edgerton have argued that the US and Britain's economy after the Cold War, after the war, depended on military industry. And also how historians as Frederick Bloch have argued that the Marshall Plan was about fighting communism, but also about creating markets. And I find that this kind of economic diplomacy has been a part of your three papers. The case of Spain, the US-Spanish agreements of 1953 were kind of a Marshall Plan for Spain, fostering aeronautics and naval industry. So I think that we need to not forget that the Cold War was framed as a war between capitalism and communism. And I think that we need to try to develop narratives that look at economics and politics as parts of the same coin for Cold War science and for scientists as diplomats. And well, that used to be called political economy in the good old days. But
Helmut Rischler, Munich. Amanda, I really have to blame the organizers for not having situated or located your paper into the first session on environments, because what you very nicely showed is that human-animal relations, human-animal studies is one of the most flourishing, one of the most dynamic fields in, say, environmental studies. So thanks for an excellent paper, but also two observations. One is very much in line with Janvi. I mean, in your paper, you more stressed, say, the continuities more than the breaks. The continuities with, again, so to speak, high modernism elements, imperialism, colonialism. I think, I mean, to frame it as such, it would be more rewarding. My second observation is human-animal relations often put, say, agency to non-human actors. So if you in a way balance, would like to balance your paper, have a more symmetric approach. That means these say rinderpest virus have their own life. They try to, they often escape human controls. They have their own agendas. So I would urge you to put it into a more symmetric picture, which would enrich your story very much.
So, no.
Okay, to Maria Jesus, of course, you're right. Internationalism was very much part of the US agenda, and at first conducted via the Marshall Plan. And my point was here to point to the differences in the two parts of Europe, you know, and what is intriguing is that the US conceptualizes already via the Marshall Plan Europe as a whole, you know, and then Western Europe as a whole, what the Soviet Union never does. The Soviet Union really goes for bilateral relationships, and this is a big difference. And this makes it more complicated for the East European countries in these situations, because their connections to the West, they are not completely broken, but they are now politically controlled. And as I said, quoting each other is something very different from collaborating with each other, and this is no longer possible. So then they have to build up new networks and within the Eastern Bloc, and I found this seems to be much more complicated than it is in Western Europe. Of course, I think it was your comment, for Western Europe, it is a complicated process as well, and all the institutions that are established, there are lots of conflicts. But if we compare it with the East, then the picture shifts a little bit, because nevertheless, at least in my field, all this collaboration works quite well. And when I started going into it, I thought, wow, this is so interesting how all these transnational networks, they really blossom and come up in the West, and in the East this happens later.
Well, I do agree that internationalism is a key word, but a polysemic one and difficult. Anyhow, when von Karman wrote that he tried to expand the principles, I am quoting him, the principle of scientific cooperation to all nations, this is also must be understood as how he understood internationalism. Of course, it was a kind of internationalism. That was one of my points. Because of that, I spoke about compartmentalization. Is an idea, a kind of internationalism that did not prevent the division between the two great blocs. So it's true. Tony Mallet asked, and you too, Jessica, for a definition of internationalism. I don't think that we can use one single definition, as in many words, which has many different senses. Well, one of the points that Tony Mallet made was an interesting question: to what extent Theodor von Karman was aware of what was going on in Spanish society? You asked that. Well, I think I read all the letters that are in the von Karman archives between him and the Spaniards. This question doesn't appear at all, because he was, to say so, surrounded always by a part of the Spanish society which was well off, which was in perfect agreement with the Spanish regime. So I am sure that he didn't care. And again, it's another manifestation, an obvious one, of compartmentalization. No problem at all. I agree with you that the Cold War has an obvious economic dimension, and in fact, this is in my paper in the case of the Spanish, because I mentioned, I read again, that I said that one of the things I skipped from my presentation is what von Karman and his Spanish correspondents said about industry. Von Karman not only did politics in Spain, but this business. And he was, this is another of the words that Tony Mallet used, he lobbied for US industries, of course, without no doubt. And I mentioned the case of the Aerojet Engineering Corporation, which was also not only industry, but also it was a good business for Caltech. So that's true. And I agree that we have to pay much attention in our presentation to that aspect of the Cold War, which is not, it was not only a political confrontation, but an economic one. One question to Maria Jesus, even it was not for me, but I think you said that I think I understood you. I am not sure that you said, and it's important, that internationalism again this word was put on the agenda by nuclear science and technology. Did you say something of the sort? Well, no, I don't think. I don't think so. Well, certainly the nuclear science, the stresses that and contributed to put on the agenda the question of internationalism, but. Well, as I try to argue in my paper, the internationalism was also put on the agenda, international agenda, by aeronautics. Do remember that aviation, aeronautics was more important to the development of the history of World War II than nuclear science, than nuclear bombs, which will appear only at the end of the war. So I think that, of course, it's true that nuclear physics and nuclear science and technology are important as far as the question of internationalism, how we define that word, but also aeronautical science too.
Again, I really think this idea of internationalism and international cooperation is a really interesting concept to think about in the future. In terms of the image that very disturbed you, what I was trying to emphasize is the farmer versus the veterinarian. And it doesn't matter if the farmer is Ethiopian. In that case, it was. But to me, my experience with farmers who have a small number of cattle, be it in the United States, in Michigan with my grandfather, or be it in Ethiopia in Diradawa, is that they do know their animals, and the animal matters to them as an animal, as an individual. But for the veterinarian, the animal has no individuality. The point there is that you're talking about the global eradication, so the individual farmer's cow is just a member of this, like the entire human, ownership of all cows everywhere. And that's what I was trying to stress with that image, that there's the real gap between what the individual farmers needed and wanted in the grassroots and why they're involved in this activity, and what these veterinarians being sent from FAO are trying to do. The distinction there is that, yes, people have two very different perspectives of the situation. In terms of the actual Rinderpest virus, I do that in the larger work. I mean, give the Rinderpest a little more of I'm careful with agency, but give it more of its own story, right? What is Rinderpest, the history that we know thus far? It used to be, scientists estimate that it was probably measles and Rinderpest were the same virus. I mean, there's a really interesting story there of this history of the virus as we know it. And in terms of the common humanity, the work against the non-human, this would be the case. Rinderpest would just be one example. I mean, you have breeding of new, the actual breeding of new animals, like bringing in animals from different places and trying to create new animals, new strains of, say, wheat rust, that all of it is sort of this larger project of human control over the non-human, and that takes a variety of forms. But if you think about almost all of these development activities that are tied to agriculture in this period, most of them are, and they're grassroots, and it really is about changing other things or expanding human control over these other human things or non-human things. And that's sort of where I think it's kind of an interesting way of thinking about who is doing, with anti-leprosy programs. It's the same kind of thing, or what FAO is doing in the Philippines with rice, a variety of activities. I don't think that's the only way of telling the story, that it's this human power, but I just think that's an interesting way to think about human dominion over the non-human as a way of making sense of what development is trying to do in this period. I don't know if I didn't answer any other questions. What was yours? Oh, I have talked. So I've talked to him about this at Schaefer last year. The distinction is that in the 1950s, the Soviet Union isn't involved. They're not involved with the Rinderpress activities. Now, later on they are, but in the period I'm looking at, through the 40s, 50s, into the early 60s, before you have the plow-right vaccine in 1962, they're just not involved. So it is really happening outside of this.
But the U.S. is involved.
Well, the U.S. is kind of involved. So the U.S. obviously helps fund FAO. I mean, money comes to FAO through the United States. And the United States, what happens is, like, in Ethiopia, there's sort of this, the 4 program works with FAO. They help fund it, and they work on the ground. So it's always FAO veterinarians taking the lead in these countries, or originally UNRRA in China, but then the United States supplies most of the funding. So basically in Ethiopia, farmers weren't going to get the vaccine, and so the FAO decided they needed to pay farmers to bring their cattle in to get the vaccine, but they didn't have the money. And so the United States put up all the money to pay the farmers to allow their cattle to get vaccinated. So that's how the U.S. gets involved. And of course, many of the veterinarians are U.S., but they're working for FAO.
But that's what I mean about the multiple agendas that are arguing
Yeah.
for work. Because the U.S. is not doing this simply because of common humanity. That's also presumably has Cold War objectives.
Well, is it Cold War, though? Because the food and agriculture, when it starts, is before the Cold War, and it's really about food security, right? And so it's because this starts in 47, that they really start. For 46, they start funding it in China. So that's true, I guess you could say, when you think the Cold War starts.
Or we can go back to the passage in de Tocqueville and say
But-
it's foreordained.
But it's, I mean, I would say there's the real economic, what he was talking about, the political economy, definitely, right? Because it's about the market, and it's about this food security and people having access to it. But they really don't talk about it themselves in a specific Cold War language. They talk about it in this development language. And then I disagree. I think it begins way before the Cold War. I mean, that part of my argument of my book is that this is economic growth theory, and this is way before the Cold War, that you have this language of economic development for economic purposes, right?
Just a comment on this is that, each of the UN specialized agencies sort of has its own kind of national identity, and FAO is particularly associated with the United States, which is, I think, one of the main reasons that the Soviet Union doesn't join it. And in the UN system, the food program is kind of understood as that's kind of the US territory if you're going to get involved in it. And food security is about American and Canadian grain surpluses as much as it is about providing enough food and leverage, as Ron and Chris have written about too. American diplomatic leverage, I think, is that. So I totally agree with you that the language of development has a much longer history that this is tapping into, and that you do need to take off the Cold War lens to look at the Rinderpest campaign for sure. They have other anxieties than just the Soviet Union. I would also encourage you to be careful about, especially dealing with FAO and that sort of thing.
I mean, just as a minor thing, the point is also to get rid of this virus. I mean, this benefits everyone for the virus to go away. So there's a political benefit to the United States. It had never broken out in North America, but as you can see from their activities, they're willing to put tons of money into a program to make sure it doesn't break out in North America. So there's part of it is just getting rid of the virus is beneficial to the United States as itself, as the largest producer of beef in the world. I mean...
Simone Turchetti, University of Manchester, and Theos. And Linus Boss. All right, now, it's a point for Jose. I must confess, I feel quite uncomfortable with the image of the Cold War missionary. Unless, we consider missionary in terms of spreading a new gospel that was ultimately a Cold War gospel, there are interesting ideas that could come out of it. But I mean, I think the actual image of missionary, as you put it forward, I find it, you know, troubling, at least for someone that ultimately was going around making deals about airplanes to fight a war, to sending really launching missiles to European countries. I'm sorry, are kind of striking to me. That said, I mean, the question is purely framed in terms of, you know, what do you aim to achieve as an historian? As in, when you say that you've been to Caltech and you've seen the correspondence with all the other Spaniards, I'm wondering, can we actually understand von Karman just looking at his correspondence with Spaniards? Because, say, I've been in the same archive, for instance, and I started looking at von Karman's deals with the Italians, which is pretty much the same. He goes to Italy, has Italian correspondence. He actually goes to Fiat. Fiat is actually the firm that throughout the fascist regime in Italy has been completely subservient to the regime. Nonetheless, von Karman is decisive for Fiat to have a very lucrative deal with the construction of the first NATO light fighter. He goes to Turkey. He does exactly the same. Von Karman is in Turkey, I think, probably in the very same way as a missionary, as someone that he ultimately helped the Turkish to get into NATO, to get light fighters, to get ballistic missiles, to get a lot of weaponry at the end of the day. So I don't know. I mean, I'm puzzled about the use of the terms and the ways in which you basically deal with the historical sources. That's all.
Would you be more comfortable with ambassador?
Ambassador, it could be actually entail some kind of interest. I don't know. Again, I mean, missionary in terms of spreading the new gospel actually has interesting. But you could probably use it in a kind of more nuanced way, I would say. But I don't know. I mean, it's your choice. No
Well,
way.
maybe the name is not perfect, but I use not to complain or not to fight about titles. So I think, for what you had said, Simon, that we on the whole agree about that kind of activities of von Karman in countries like Spain, Italy, Turkey, with the difference that Italy and Turkey and others were not as isolated for as much time as Spain, which is an important difference. Turkey became a member of NATO, while Spain not, until after Franco died. So this is an important. So for the Spaniards, for the military and the aeronautical science and practically all the aeronautic men, and this institution was controlled by military. This National Institute of Aeronautical Techniques I mentioned was created in 1942 within the Ministry of the Aviation, which was a military ministry. So this make a big difference. It was von Karman really very important, that connection, some ambassador, a lobbyist, or whatever you want. If you don't like the word missionary, well, I won't defend it too much.
To Amanda. I think, Amanda, the biggest problem for some of us is that the structures of power embedded in what is happening in the ground in Ethiopia are not explicit and in fact are rather mystified by talking about this as an international operation. It seems that Africa has no voice in this to begin with. The farmer clearly has no voice. The governments apparently have no voice because the farmers have to be paid to bring their cattle for this vaccination. So I think it's important that it might be good to vaccinate these animals. It might be good for the animals, it might be good for the farmers, but we just don't know that. But above all, we don't know the structures of power at work in this process. And I think it's important to unravel and unpack them to see precisely what's happening on the ground in terms of America imposing perhaps a solution on people who don't want it. That's what I have to say.